Section 10 of The Lost Valley and Other Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Price of Wiggins's Orgy. 1. It happened to be a Saturday when Samuel Wiggins drew the first cash sum on account of his small legacy. Some £20, 10 in gold and 10 in notes. It felt in his pocket like a bottled-up prolongation of life. Never before had he seen so many dreams within practical reach. It produced in him a kind of high and elusive exaltation of the spirit. From time to time he put his hand down to make the notes crackle, and let his fingers play through the running sovereigns as children play through sand. For 20 years he had been secretary to a philanthropist interested in feeding the poor. Soup kitchens had been the keynote of those 20 years. The distribution of victuals his sole objective. And now he had his reward. A legacy of £100 a year for the balance of his days. To him it was riches. He wore a shortish frock coat, a low spreading collar, a black made-up tie, and boots with elastic sides. On this particular day he wore also a new pair of rather brightly yellow leather gloves. He was unmarried, over 40, bald, plump in the body, and possessed of a simple and emotional heart almost childlike. His brown eyes shone in a face that was wrinkled and dusty, all his dreams driven inwards by the long years of uninspired toil for another. For the first time in his life, released from the dingy purlieus of soup kitchens and the like, he wandered towards evening among the gay and lighted streets of the West End, Piccadilly Circus, where the flaming lamps positively hurt the eyes, and Leicester Square. It was bewildering and delightful, this freedom. It went to his head, yet he ought to have known better. "I'm going to dine at a restaurant tonight, by Jove," he said to himself, thinking of the gloomy boarding-house where he usually sat between a missionary and a typewriter. He fingered his money. "I'm going to celebrate my legacy. I've earned it." The thought of a motor car flashed absurdly through his mind. It was followed by another, a holiday in Spain, Italy, Hungary, one of those sunny countries where music was cheap, in the open air, and of the romantic kind he loved. These thoughts show the kind of exaltation that possessed him. "It's nearly, though not quite, £2 a week," he repeated to himself for the 50th time, reflecting upon his legacy. "I simply can't believe it." After indecision that threatened to be endless, he turned at length through the swinging glass doors of a big and rather gorgeous restaurant. Only once before in his life had he dined at a big London restaurant, a railway hotel. Passing with some hesitation through the gaudy café, where a number of foreigners sat drinking at little marble tables, he entered the main dining room, long, lofty, and already thronged. Here the light and noise and movement dazed him considerably, and for the life of him he could not decide upon a table. The people all looked so prosperous and important, the waiters so like gentlemen in evening dress, the kind that came to the philanthropist's table. The roar of voices, eating, knives and forks, rose about him and filled him with a certain dismay. It was all rather overwhelming. "I should have liked a smaller place better," he murmured, "but still—" And again he fingered his money to gain confidence. The choice of a table was intimidating, for he was absurdly retiring, was Wiggins, more at home with papers and the reports of philanthropic societies, his holidays spent in a boarding-house at Worthing with his sister and her invalid husband. Then relief came in the form of a sub-head waiter who, spying his helplessness, inquired with a bland grandeur of manner if he looked perhaps for someone. "Oh, a table, thanks, only a table." The man, washing his hands in mid-air, swept down the crowded aisles and found one without the least difficulty. It emerged from nowhere so easily that Wiggins felt he had been a fool not to discover it alone. He wondered if he ought to tip the man half a crown now or later, but before he could decide, another occupied his place, bland and smiling, with black eyes and plush-like hair, bending low before him and holding out a large pink program. He examined it, feeling that he ought to order dishes with outlandish names just to show that he knew his way about. Before he could steady his eye upon a single line, however, a third waiter, very youthful, suggested in broken English that Wiggins should leave his hat, coat, an umbrella elsewhere. This he did willingly, though without grace or dispatch, for the yellow gloves stuck ridiculously to his hands. Then he sat down and turned to the menu again. It was a very ordinary restaurant, really, in spite of the vast height of the gilded ceiling, the scale of its sham magnificence, and the excessive glitter of its 100 lights. The menu, disguised by various expensive and recherché dishes, which, when ordered, were invariably found to be off, was even more ordinary than the hall. But to the dazed Wiggins the words looked like a series of death sentences printed in different languages, but all meaning the same thing: order me or die. That waiter standing over him was the executioner. Unless he speedily ordered something really worth the proprietor's while to provide, the head waiter would be summoned, and he, Wiggins, would be beheaded. Those stars against certain cheap dishes meant that they could only be ordered by privileged persons, and those crosses— "This is very nice this evening, sir," said the waiter, suddenly bending and pointing with a dirty finger to a dish that Wiggins found buried in a list uncommonly like voluntary subscriptions in his reports. It was entitled Lancashire Hot Pot, 2.0. 2 shillings, not 2 pounds, as he first imagined. He leaped at it. "Yes, thanks. That'll do, then, for tonight," he said, and the waiter ambled away indifferently, looking all round the room in search of sympathy. By degrees, however, the other recovered his self-possession, and realized that to spend his legacy on mere hot pot was to admit he knew not the values of life. He called the plush-headed waiter back, and, with a rush of words, ordered some oysters, soup, a fried sole, and half a partridge to follow. "Then the hot pot, sir?" queried the man with respect. "I'll see about that later." For he was already wondering what he should drink, knowing nothing of wines and vintages. At luncheon with the philanthropist he sometimes had a glass of sherry. At Worthing with his sister he drank beer. But now he wanted something really good, something generous that would help him to celebrate. He would have ordered champagne as a conciliation to the waiter, now positively obsequious, but someone had told him once that there was not enough champagne in the world to go round, and that hotels and restaurants were supplied with something rather bad. Burgundy, he felt, would be more the thing: rich, sunny, full-bodied. He studied the wine card till his head swam. A waiter, while he was thus engaged, sidled up and watched him from an angle. Wiggins, looking up distractedly at the same moment, caught his eye. Phew! It was the head waiter himself, a man of quite infinite presence, who at once bowed himself forward, and with a gentle but commanding manner drew his attention to the wines he could especially recommend. Something in the man's face struck him momentarily as familiar, vaguely familiar, then passed. Now Wiggins, as has been said, did not know one wine from another, but the spirit of his foolish pose fairly had him by the throat at last, and each time this condescending individual indicated a new vintage, he shook his head knowingly and shrugged his shoulders with the air of a connoisseur. This pantomime continued for several minutes. "Something really good, he mumbled after a while, determined to justify himself in the eyes of this high official who was taking such pains. "A rare wine, with body in it." Then he added with a sudden impulse of confidence, "It's Saturday night, remember?" And he smiled knowingly, making a gesture that a man of the world was meant to understand. Why he should have said this remains a mystery. Perhaps it was a semi-apologetic reference to the supposed habit of men to indulge themselves on a Saturday because they need not rise early to work the next day. Perhaps it was meant in some way to excuse all the trouble he was giving. In any case, there can be no question that the manner of the head waiter instantly changed in a subtle way difficult to describe, and from mere official politeness passed into deferential attention. He bowed slightly. He increased his distance by an inch or two. Wiggins, noticing it and slightly bewildered, repeated his remark, for want of something to say more than anything else. "It's Saturday night, of course," he repeated, murmuring, yet putting more meaning into the words than they could reasonably hold. "As monsieur says," the man replied, with a marked respect in his tone not there before, "and we close early." "Of course," said the other, gaining confidence pleasantly. "You close early." He had quite forgotten the fact, even if he ever knew it, but he spoke with decision. Glancing up from the wine list, he caught the man's eye, then instantly lowered his gaze, for the head waiter was staring at him in a fixed and curious manner that seemed unnecessary. And once again that passing touch of familiarity appeared upon the features and was gone.
"Monsieur is here for the first time, if I may ask?"
came next. Yes, I am," he replied, thinking all this attention a trifle excessive.
"Ah, pardon, of course, I understand,"
the head waiter added softly.
A recent member, then?"
A little nonplussed, a little puzzled, Wiggins agreed with a nod of the head. He did not know that head waiters referred to customers as members. For an instant it occurred to him that possibly he was being mistaken for somebody else. It was really... But at that moment the oysters arrived. The head waiter said something in rapid Italian to his subordinate, something that obviously increased that plush-headed person's desire to please, bent over with his best manner to murmur,
"And I will get monsieur the wine he will like, the right kind of wine,"
and was gone. It was a new and delightful sensation. Wiggins, feeling proud, pleased, and important under the effect of this excellent service and attention, turned to his oysters. The wine would come presently, and meanwhile the music had begun. 2. He began to enjoy himself thoroughly, and the wine, still fragrant, soft, soon ran in his veins and drove out the last vestige of his absurd shyness. Behind the palm trees, somewhere out of sight, the orchestra played soothingly, and if the selections were somewhat bizarre, it made no difference to him. He drank in the sound just as he drank in the wine, eagerly. Both fed the consciousness that he was enjoying himself, and the danse macabre gave him as much pleasure as did the bohème, the Strauss waltz, or Donizetti. Everything, wine, music, food, people, served to intensify his interest in himself. He examined his face in the big mirrors and realized what a dog he was and what a good time he was having. He watched the other customers, finding them splendid and distinguished. The whole place was really fine. He would come again and again, always ordering the same wine, for it was certainly an unusual wine, as the head waiter had called it, the right kind. The price of it he never asked, for in his pocket lay the price of a whole case. His hand slipped down to finger the sovereigns, hot and slippery now, and the notes, somewhat moist and crumpled. The needles of the big staring clock, meanwhile, swung onwards. Thus, aided by the tactful and occasional superintendence of the head waiter from a distance, the evening passed along into a happy rush of pleasurable emotion. The half-partridge had vanished, and Wiggins toyed now with a wonderful-looking sweet, the most expensive he could find. He did not eat much of it, but liked to see it on his plate. The wine helped things enormously. He had ordered another half-bottle some time ago, delighted to find that it exhilarated without confusing him. And everyone else in the place was enjoying himself in the same way. He was thrilled to discover this. Only one thing jarred a little. A very big man with a round, clean-shaven face, inclined to fatness, stared at him more than he cared about from a table in the corner diagonally across the room. He had only come in half an hour ago. His face was somehow or other dog-like. Something between a boarhound and a pup, Wiggins thought. Each time he looked up, the fellow's large and rather fierce eyes were fixed upon him, then lingeringly withdrawn. It was unpleasant to be stared at in this way by an offensive physiognomy. But most of the time he was too full of personal visions conjured up by the wine to trouble long about external matters. His head was simply brimming over with thoughts and ideas, about himself, about soup kitchens, feeding the poor, the change of life effected by the legacy, and 1,000 other details. Once or twice, however, in sharp, clear moments when the tide of alcohol ebbed a little, other questions assailed him. Why should the head waiter have become so obsequious and attentive? What was it in his face that seemed familiar? What was there about the remark, "It's Saturday evening," to change his manner? And what was it about the dinner, the restaurant, and the music that seemed just a little out of the ordinary? Or was he merely thinking nonsense? And was it his imagination that this man stared so oddly? The alcohol rushed deliciously in his veins. The vague uneasiness, however, was a passing matter, for the orchestra was tearing madly through a sardis, and his thoughts and feelings were swept away in the wild rhythm. He drank his bottle out and ordered another. Was it the second or the third? He could not remember. Counting always made his head ache. He did not care anyhow. Let her go. I'm enjoying myself. I've got a fat legacy. Money lying in the bank. Money I haven't earned. The carefulness of years was destroyed in as many minutes. That music's simply spiffling. Then he glanced up and caught the clean-shaven face bearing down upon him across the shimmering room, like the muzzle of a moving gun. He tried to meet it, but found he could not focus it properly. The same moment he saw that he was mistaken. The man was merely staring at him. Two faces swam and wobbled into one. This movement and the appearance of coming towards him were both illusions produced by the alcohol. He drank another glass quickly to steady his vision, and then another. I'll call for my bill. It's time to go, he murmured aloud, later with a very deep sigh. He looked about him for the waiter, who instantly appeared with coffee and liqueurs, however. Dear me, yes. Quite forgot I ordered those, he observed offhand, smiling in the man's face, willing and anxious to say a lot of things, but not quite certain what. My bill, was what he said finally. Mush bluff. The waiter laughed pleasantly, but very politely in reply. Wiggins repeated his remark about his bill.
Oh, that will be all right, sir,
returned the man, as though no such thing as pavement was ever heard of in this restaurant. It was rather confusing. Wiggins laughed to himself, drank his liqueur, and forgot about everything except the ballet music of Delibes. The strings were sprinkling in a silver shower about the hall. His mind ran after them through the glittering air. Just fancy if I could catch 'em and take 'em home in a bunch, he said to himself, immensely pleased. He was enjoying himself hugely by now. And then suddenly he became aware that the place was rapidly thinning, lights being lowered, good nights being said, and that everybody seemed drunk. Perhaps they've all got legacies, he thought, flushing with excitement. He rose unsteadily to his feet and was delighted to find that he was not in the least drunk. He at once respected himself. It's really disgusting that fellas can't stop when they've had enough, he murmured, making his way with steps that required great determination towards the door, and remembering before he got halfway that he had not paid his bill. Turning in a half-circle that brought an unnecessary quantity of the room round with him, he made his way back, lost his way, fumbled about in the increasing gloom, and found himself face to face with the head waiter. The unexpected meeting braced him astonishingly. The dignity of the man had curiously increased. I'm looking for my bill, observed Wiggins thickly, wondering for the 20th time of whom the man's face reminded him. You haven't seen it about anywhere, I suppose. He sat down with more dignity than he could have supposed possible and produced a 5-pound note from his pocket, the lining of the pocket coming out with it like a dirty glove. Most of the guests had gone out by this time, and the big hall was very dark. 2 lights only remained, and these, reflected from mirror to mirror, made its proportions seem vast and unreal. They flew from place to place, too, distressingly, these lights.
A thick ground will settle that, sir,
replied the man with a respectful bow. Nonsense, replied the other. Why, I ordered Lancashire hotchpotch, grill sole, a bird or something of the kind, and the wine.
I beg your pardon, sir, but if you will permit me to say so, the others will soon be here now, and as there will be a specially large attendance, perhaps you would like to make sure of your place.
He pocketed the half-crown with a bow, pointing to the far dim corner of the room, and stepped aside a little to make space for Wiggins to pass. And Wiggins did pass, though it is not quite clear how he managed to dodge the flying tables. With deep sighs, hot, confused, and puzzled, but too obfuscated to understand what it was all about, he obeyed the directions, at the same time wondering uneasily how it was he had forgotten what was afoot. He wandered towards the end of the hall with the uncertainty of a butterfly that makes many feints before it settles. At a vast distance off, the head waiter was moving to close the main doors, utterly oblivious now of his existence. He felt glad of that. Something about that fellow was disagreeable, downright nasty. This suddenly came over him with a flood of conviction. The man was more than peculiar. He was sinister. The air smelt horribly of cooked food, tobacco smoke, breathing crowds, scented women, and the rest. Whiffs of it, hot and fetid, brought him a little to his senses. Then suddenly he noticed that the big man with the face that was dark and smooth like the muzzle of a cannon was watching him keenly from a table on the other side, where an electric light still burned. "By George, there he is again, that feller. Wonder what she's smiling at me for. Looking for Bill, too, p'raps. Now, in a soup kitchen, nothing of the kind." He bowed in return, smiling insolently, holding himself steady by a chair to do so. He shoved and stumbled his way on into the shadows, half mingling with the throng passing out into the street. Then, making a sharp turn back into the room unobserved, he took a few uncertain steps and collapsed silently and helplessly upon a chair that was hidden behind a big palm tree in a dark corner. And the last thing he remembered as he sank, boneless like soft hay, into that corner was that the sham palm tree bowed towards him, then ran off into the ceiling, and from that elevation, which in no way diminished its size, bowed to him yet again. It was just after his eyes closed that the door in the gilt paneling at the end of the room softly opened, and a woman entered on tiptoe. She was followed by other women and several girls, these again from time to time by men, all dressed in black, all silent, and all ushered by the majestic head waiter to their places. The big man with the face like a gun muzzle superintended, and each individual on entering was held there at the secret doorway until a certain sentence had passed his lips, evidently a password. "It is Saturday night," said the one being admitted.
"And we close early,"
replied the head waiter and the big man. And then the door was closed until the next soft tapping came. But Wiggins, plunged in the stupor of the first sleep, knew none of all this. His frock coat was bunched about his neck, his black tie under his ear, his feet resting higher than his head. He looked like a collapsed airship in a hedge, and he snored heavily. 3. It was about an hour later when he opened his eyes, climbed painfully and heavily to his feet, staggered back against the wall utterly bewildered, and stared. At the far end of the great hall, its loftiness now dim, was a group of people. The big mirrors on all sides reflected them with the effect of increasing their numbers indefinitely. They stood and sat upon an improvised platform. The electric lights, shaded with black, dropped a pale glitter upon their faces. They were systematically grouped, the big man in the center, the head waiter at a small table just behind him. The former was speaking in low, measured tones. In his dark and distant corner, Wiggins first of all seized the carafe and quenched his feverish thirst. Next he advanced slowly, and with the utmost caution, to a point nearer the group where he could hear what was being said. He was still a good deal confused in mind, and had no idea what the hour was or what he had been doing in the meantime. There were some 20 or 30 people, he saw, of both sexes, well-dressed, many of them distinguished in appearance, and all wearing black. Even their gloves were black. Some of the women, too, wore black veils, very thick. But in all the faces, without exception, there was something, was it about the lips and mouths, that was peculiar and repellent. Obviously, this was a meeting of some kind. Some society had hired the hall for a private gathering. Wiggins, understanding this, began to feel awkward. He did not wish to intrude. He had no right to listen, yet to make himself known was to betray that he was still very considerably intoxicated. The problem presented itself in these simple terms to his dazed intelligence. He was also aware of another fact. About these black-robed people there was something which made him secretly and horribly afraid. The big man with the smooth face like a gun muzzle sat down after a softly uttered speech, and the group, instead of applauding with their hands, waved black handkerchiefs. The fluttering sound of them trickled along the wastes of hall towards the concealed eavesdropper. Then the head waiter rose to introduce the next speaker, and the instant Wiggins saw him, he understood what it was in his face that was familiar. For the false beard no longer adorned his lips, the wig that altered the shape of his forehead and the appearance of his eyes had been removed, and the likeness he bore to the philanthropist, Wiggins' late employer, was too remarkable to be ignored. Wiggins just repressed a cry, but a low gasp apparently did escape him, for several members of the group turned their heads in his direction and stared. The head waiter, meanwhile, saved him from immediate discovery by beginning to speak. The words were plainly audible, and the resemblance of the voice to that other voice he knew now to be stopped with dust was one of the most dreadful experiences he had ever known. Each word, each trick of expression came as a new and separate shock.
"And the learned doctor will say a few words upon the rationale of our subject," he concluded, turning with a graceful bow to make room for a distinguished-looking old gentleman who advanced shambling from the back of the improvised platform. What Wiggins then heard, in somewhat disjointed sentences owing to the buzzing in his ears, was at first apparently meaningless. Yet it was freighted, he knew, with a creeping and sensational horror that would fully reveal itself the instant he discovered the clue. The old clever-faced scoundrel was saying vile things. He knew it. But the key to the puzzle being missing, he could not quite guess what it was all about. The doctor, gravely and with balanced phrases, seemed to be speaking of the fads of the day with regard to food and feeding. He ridiculed vegetarianism and all the other isms. He said that one and all were based upon ignorance and fallacy, declaring that the time had at last come in the history of the race when a rational system of feeding was a paramount necessity. The physical and psychical conditions of the times demanded it, and the soul of man could never be emancipated until it was adopted. He himself was proud to be one of the founders of their audacious and secret society, revolutionary and pioneer in the best sense, to which so many medical fraternity now belonged, and so many of the brave women, too, who were in the van of the feminist movements of the times. He said a great deal in this vein. Wiggins, listening in growing amazement and uneasiness, waited for the clue to it all. In conclusion, the speaker referred solemnly to the fact that there was a stream of force in their society which laid them open to the melancholy charge of being called hysterical. "But after all," he cried with rising enthusiasm and in accents that rang down the hall, "a society without hysteria is a dull society, just as a woman without hysteria is a dull woman. Neither the society nor the woman need yield to the tendency, but that it is present potentially infers the faculty, so delicious in the eyes of all sane men, the faculty of running to extremes. It is a sign of life, and of very vivid life. It is not for nothing, dear friends, that we are named the—" But the buzzing in Wiggins's ears was so loud at this moment that he missed the name. It sounded to him something between Can I Believes and Camels, but for the life of him he could not overtake the actual word. The doctor had uttered it, moreover, in a lowered voice, a suddenly lowered voice. When the noise in his ears had passed, he heard the speaker bring his address to an end in these words: "And I will now ask the secretaries to make their reports from the various sections, after which I understand—" His tone grew suddenly thick and clouded. "We are to be regaled with a collation, a sacramental collation of the usual kind." His voice hushed away to nothing. His mouth was working most curiously. A wave of excitement unquestionably ran over the faces of the others. Their mouths also worked oddly. Dark and somber things were afoot in that hall. Wiggins crouched a little lower behind the edge of the overhanging tablecloth and listened. He was perspiring now, but there were touches of icy horror fingering about in the neighborhood of his heart. His mental and physical discomfort were very great, for the conviction that he was about to witness some dreadful scene, black as the garments of the participants in it, grew rapidly within him. He devised endless plans for escape, only to reject them the instant they were formed. There was no escape possible. He had to wait till the end. A charming young woman was on her feet,
addressing the audience in silvery tones. Sweet and comely she was, her beauty only marred by that singular leer that visited the lips and mouths of all of them. The flesh of his back began to crawl as he listened. He would have given his whole year's legacy to be out of it, for behind that voice of silver and sweetness there crowded even to her lips the rush of something that was unutterable, loathsome. Wiggins felt it. The uncertainty as to its exact nature only added to his horror and distress.
"So this question of supply, my friends," she was saying, "is becoming more and more difficult. It resolves itself into a question of ways and means."
She looked round upon her audience with a touch of nervous apprehension before she continued.
"In my particular sphere of operations, West Kensington, I have regretfully to report that the suspicions and activity of the police, the foolish, old-fashioned police, have now rendered my monthly contributions no longer possible. There have been too many disappearances of late."
She paused, casting her eyes down. Wiggins felt his hair rise, drawn by a shivery wind. The words contributions and disappearances brought with them something quite freezing.
"As you know," the girl resumed, "it is to the doctors that we must look chiefly for our steadier supplies, and unfortunately in my sphere of operations we have but one doctor who is a member. I do not like to resign my position, but I must ask for lenient consideration of my failure."
Her voice sank lower still.
"My failure to furnish tonight the materials."
She began to stammer and hesitate dreadfully. Her voice shook, an ashen pallor spread to her very lips.
"The elements for our customary feast."
A movement of disapproval ran over the audience like a wave. Murmurs of dissent and resentment were heard. As the girl paled more perceptibly, the singular beauty of her face stood out with an effect of almost shining against that dark background of shadows and black garments. In spite of himself, and forgetting caution for the moment, Wiggins peeped over the edge of the table to see her better. She was a lady, he saw, high-bred and spirited. That pallor, and the timidity it bespoke, was but evidence of a highly sensitive nature facing a situation of peculiar difficulty and danger. He read in her attitude, in the poise of that slim figure standing there before disapproval and possible disaster, the bearing and proud courage of a type that would face execution with calmness and dignity. Wiggins was amazed that this thought should flash through him so vividly, from nowhere. Born of the feverish aftermath of alcohol, perhaps, yet born inevitably, too, of this situation before his eyes. With a thrill, he realized that the girl was speaking again, her voice steady but faint with the gravity of her awful position.
"And I ask for that justice in consideration of my failure which the difficulties of the position demand. I have had to choose between that bold and ill-considered action which might have betrayed us all to the authorities, and the risk of providing nothing for tonight."
She sat down. Wiggins understood that it was a question of life and death. The air about him turned icy. He felt the perspiration trickling on several different parts of his body at once. An old lady rose instantly to reply. Her face was stern and dreadful, although the signature of breeding and culture was plainly there in the delicate lines about the nostrils and forehead. Her mien held something implacable. She was dressed in black silk that rustled, and she was certainly well over 60. But what made Wiggins squirm there in his narrow hiding place was the extraordinary resemblance she bore to Mrs. Sturgis, the superintendent of one of his late employer's soup kitchens. It was all diabolically grotesque. She glanced round upon the group of members who clearly regarded her as a leader. The machinery of the whole dreadful scene then moved quicker. "Then we are to understand from the West Kensington secretary," she began in firm, even tones, "that for tonight there is nothing?" The young girl bowed her head without rising from her chair. "I beg to move, then, Mr. Chairman," continued the terrible old lady in iron accents, "that the customary procedure be followed, and that a committee of 3 be appointed to carry it into immediate effect." The words fell like bombshells into the deserted spaces of the hall. "I second the motion," was heard in a man's voice. "Those in favor of the motion will show their hands," announced the big chairman with the clean-shaven face. Several score of black-gloved hands waved in the air, with the effect of plumes upon a jolting hearse. "And those who oppose it?" No single hand was raised. An appalling hush fell upon the group. "I appoint Signor Carnamorte as the chairman of the subcommittee, with the power to choose his associates," said the big man, and the head waiter bowed his acceptance of the duty imposed upon him. There was at once then a sign of hurried movement, and the figure of the young girl was lost momentarily to view as several members surged round her. The next instant they fell away and she stood clear, her hands bound. Her voice, soft as before but very faint, was audible through the hush.
"I claim the privilege belonging to the female members of the society," she said calmly. "The right to find, if possible, a substitute."
"Granted," answered the chairman gravely. "The customary 10 minutes will be allowed you in which to do so. Meanwhile, the preparations must proceed in the usual way." With a dread that ate all other emotions, Wiggins watched keenly from his concealment, and the preparations that he saw in progress, though simple enough in themselves, filled him with a sense of ultimate horror that was freezing. The committee of 3 were very busy with something at the back of the improvised platform, something that was heavy and, on being touched, emitted a metallic and sonorous ring. As in the strangling terror and heat of nightmare, the full meaning of events is often kept concealed until the climax, so Wiggins knew that this simple sound portended something that would only be revealed to him later. Something appalling as Satan, sinister as the grave. That ring of metal was the gong of death. He heard it in his own heart, and the shock was so great that he could not prevent an actual physical movement. His jerking leg drove sharply against a chair. The chair squeaked. The sound pierced the deep silence of the big hall with so shrill a note that of course everybody heard it. Wiggins, expecting to have the whole crew of these black-robed people about his ears, held his breath in an agony of suspense. All those pairs of eyes, he felt, were searching the spot where he lay so thinly hidden by the tablecloth. But no steps came towards him. A voice, however, spoke, the voice of the girl. She had heard the sound, and had divined its cause.
"Loosen my bonds," she cried, "for there is someone yonder among the shadows. I have found a substitute, and I swear to heaven he is plump."
The sentence was so extraordinary that Wiggins felt a spring of secret merriment touched somewhere deep within him, and a gush of uncontrollable laughter came up in his throat so suddenly that before he could get his hand to his mouth, it rang down the long, dim hall and betrayed him beyond all question of escape. Behind it lay the strange need of violent expression. He had to do something. The life of this slender and exquisite girl was in danger. And the nightmare strain of the whole scene, the hints and innuendos of a dark purpose, the implacable nature of the decree that threatened so fair a life, all resulted in a pressure that was too much for him. Had he not laughed, he would certainly have shrieked aloud. And the next minute he did shriek aloud. The screams followed his laughter with a dreadful clamor, and at the same instant he staggered noisily to his feet and rose into full view from behind a table. Everybody then saw him. Across the length of that dimly lighted hall he faced the group of people in all their hideous reality, and what he saw cleared from his fuddled brain the last fumes of the alcohol. The white visage of each member seemed already close upon him. He saw the glimmering pallor of their skins against the black clothes, the eyes ashine, the mouths working, fingers pointing at him. There was the head waiter, more than ever like the dead philanthropist whose life had been spent in feeding others. There the odious, smooth face of the big chairman. There the stern-lipped old lady who demanded the sentence of death. The whole silent crew of them stared darkly at him, and in front of them, like some fair lily growing amid decay, stood the girl with the proud and pallid face, calm and self-controlled. Immediately beyond her, a little to one side, Wiggins next perceived the huge iron cauldron, already swinging from its mighty tripod, waiting to receive her into its capacious jaws. Beneath it gleamed and flickered the flames from a dozen spirit lamps.
"My substitute," rang out her clear voice. "My substitute! Unloose my hands, and seize him before he can escape!"
"He cannot escape!" cried a dozen angry voices. "In darkness!" thundered the chairman, and at the same moment every light was extinguished from the switchboard. Every light but one. The bulb immediately behind him in the wall was left burning. And the crew were upon him, coming swiftly and stealthily down the empty aisles between the tables. He saw their forms advance and shift by the gleam of the lamps beneath the awful cauldron. With the advance came, too, the sound of rushing, eager breathing. He imagined, though he could not see, those evil mouths a-working. And at this moment the subconscious part of him that had kept the secret all this time suddenly revealed in letters of flame the name of the society which 15 minutes before he had failed to catch. The subconscious self, that supreme stage manager, that arch-conspirator, rose and struck him in the face, as it were, out of the darkness, so that he understood with a shock of nauseous terror the terrible nature of the net in which he was caught. For this secret society, meeting for their awful rites in a great public restaurant of mid-London, were maniacs of a rare and singular description, vilely mad on one point but sane on all the rest. They were cannibals. Never before had he run with such speed, agility, and recklessness. Never before had he guessed that he could leap tables, clear chairs with the flying manner of a hurdle race, and dodge palms and flower pots as an athlete of 20 dodges collisions in the football field. But in each dark corner where he sought a temporary refuge, the electric light on the wall above immediately sprang into brilliance, one of the crew having remained by the switchboard to control this diabolically ingenious method of keeping him ever in sight. For a long time, however, he evaded his crowding and clumsy pursuers. It was a vile and ghastly chase. His flying frock-coat streamed out behind him, and he felt the elastic side of his worn boots split under the unusual strain of the twisting, turning ankles as he leaped and ran. His pursuers, it seemed, sought to prolong the hunt on purpose. The passion of the chase was in their blood. Round and round that hall, up and down over tables and under chairs, behind screens, shaking the handles of doors, all immovable, past the gleaming dish covers on the wheeled joint tables, taking cover by swing doors, curtains, palms, everything and anything, Wiggins flew for his life from the pursuing forces of a horrible death. And, at last, they caught him. Breathless and exhausted, he collapsed backwards against the wall in a dark corner. But the light instantly flashed out above him. He lay in full view, and in another second the advancing horde, he saw their eyes and mouths so close, would be upon him, when something utterly unexpected happened. His head, in falling, struck against a hard projecting substance, and a bell rang sharply out. It was a telephone. How he ever managed to get the receiver to his lips, or why the answering exchange came so swiftly, he does not pretend to know. He had just time to shout, "Help! Help! Send Police X! Restaurant! Murder! Cannibals!" when he was seized violently by the collar, his arms and legs grasped by a dozen pairs of hands, and a struggle began that he knew from the start must prove hopeless. The fact that help might be on the way, however, gave him courage. Wiggins smashed right and left, screamed, kicked, bit, and butted. His frock-coat was ripped from his back with a whistling tear of cloth and lining, and he found himself free at the edge of a group that clawed and beat everywhere about him. The dim light was now in his favor. He shot down the hall again like a hare, leaping tables on the way and flinging dish covers, carafes, menus, at the pursuing crowd as fast as he could lay hands upon them. Then came a veritable pandemonium of smashed glass and crockery, while a grip of iron caught his arms behind and pinioned them beyond all possibility of moving. Turning quickly, he found himself looking straight into the eyes of a big blue policeman, the door into the street open beside him. The crowd became at once inextricably mixed up and jumbled together. The chairman and the girl who was to have been eaten melted into a single person. The philanthropist and the old lady slid into each other. It was a horrible bit of confusion, He felt deadly sick and dizzy. Everything dropped away from his sight then, and darkness tore up round him from the carpet. He remembered nothing more for a long time. Perhaps the most vivid recollection of what occurred afterwards, he remembers it to this day, and his memory may be trusted, for he never touched wine again, was the weary smile of the magistrate, and the still more weary voice, as he said in the court 2 days later, 40 shillings, and be bound over to keep the peace in 2 sureties for 6 months, and £5 to the proprietor of the restaurant to pay damages for the broken windows and crockery. Next case. End of section 10. Section 11 of The Lost Valley and Other Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Carlton's Drive. It is difficult, of course, to estimate the effect of such a thing upon another's temperament. The change seemed bewilderingly sudden, yet spiritual chemistry is a process incalculable, past finding out, and the results in this case were undeniable. Carlton had changed in the course of a brief year or two, and he dates it from that drive. He knows. He told it to a few intimates only. Those who know his face as it is today, serene and strong, yet recall how it was scored and beaten with the ravages of dissipation a few years before, so that the human seemed almost to have dropped back into the beast, can scarcely credit his identity. Now, its calm austerity softened by the greatest yearning known to man, the yearning to save, proclaim at a glance the splendid revolution. Whereas, then, the memory is unpleasant, exceedingly wonderful, the contrast. His life was inoffensive enough, negatively at least, till the money came. Then, with the inheritance, his innate sensuality broke out. Yet it seemed a prodigious step for a man to make in so brief a time, from that life of depravity that stained his face and smothered his soul, to the brotherhood of devotion he founded, and himself led full charge against the vice of the world. But not incomprehensible, perhaps. He did nothing by halves. It was the swing of the pendulum. He was somewhere about 30, his nerves shattered by the savagery of concentrated fast living, his system too exhausted to respond even to unusual stimulant, when he found himself one early spring morning on the pavement beside St. George's Hospital. He had been up all night, and was making his way homewards on foot, his pockets stuffed with the proceedings of lucky gambling. And how he happened to be standing at that particular spot, watching the traffic at 8 in the morning, is not clear. Probably seduced by the sweetness of the air, he had wandered, driven by gusts of mood as by gusts of wind. Though he had drunk steadily since midnight, he was not so much intoxicated as fuddled, stupid. He was on the south corner, where the buses stop in their journey westwards. The sun poured a flood of light down Piccadilly. The street was brisk with pedestrians going to work, the hospital side entrance behind him already astir. Across the road, the trees in the park shimmered in a wave of fluttering green. The pride of life was in the June air. In his own heart, however, was a loathsome satiety, sign of the first death. In a line with the trees opposite stood a solitary hansom. A faint surprise that it should be there at such an hour jostled in his sodden brain with the idea that he might as well drive home, when suddenly he became aware that the man perched on the box was looking at him across the street with a fixity of manner that was both singular and offensive. Carlton felt his own gaze, bleary-eyed and troubled, somehow caught and held uncomfortably. The other's eyes were fastened upon his own, had been fastened for some time, sinisterly and with a purpose. Just at this moment, however, a sharp spasm of pain and faintness, due to exhaustion and debauch, shot through him, so that he reeled half staggering, and, before he quite knew what he was doing, he had nodded to the driver, and saw that the horse was already turning with clattering hooves to cross the slippery street. A minute later he had climbed heavily in, noticing vaguely that the driver wore all black, the horse was black, and on the whip was a strip of crepe that fluttered in the breeze. As he got in, too, the effort strained him. But more than that, something that was cold and terrible, like a hand of ragged steel, he described it afterwards, clutched at his heart. It puzzled him, but he was too done to think, and he lurched back warily on the cushions as the horse started forward with the jerkiness of long habit. "Same address, sir," the man called down through the trap. His voice was harsh, like iron, and Carlton, supposing that he recognized a fare, replied testily, "Of course, you fool, and let her rip. To the devil." The spasm of strange pain had passed. He only felt tired to brokenness, sick with his corrupt and unsatisfying life, a dull, incomprehensible anger burning in him against the world, the driver, and himself. The hansom swung forwards over the smooth, uncrowded streets like a ship with a breeze behind her, for the horse was fresh and the man drove well. He took off his opera hat and let the cool wind fan his face. That drive of a mile to his rooms was the most soothing and restful he had ever known. But after a while, braced perhaps by the morning wind, he began to notice that they were following a strange route through streets he did not recognize. He had been lolling in the corner with half-closed eyes. Now he sat up and looked about him. Time had passed. He ought to have reached home long ago. They were going at a tremendous and unholy pace, too. He poked open the trap sharply. "Hi," he called out angrily. "Are you drunk? Where in the name of blank are you driving to?" "It's all right, sir. It's the shortest way. The usual roads are closed." The man's voice, deep with a curious rumbling note, had such conviction and authority in it that Carlton accepted the explanation with a growl and flung himself back into his soft corner. Again, however, for a single second, that cold thing of steel moved horribly in his heart. He felt as if the ragged hand had given it another twist. Then it passed, and he gave himself up to the swinging motion of the drive. The hansom tore along now. It was delightful. Curious, though, that all the known streets should be up. Positively the houses were getting less, as though he was driving out into the country. Perhaps, too, the feeling of laissez-aller that came over him was caused by some inhibition of the will due to prolonged excesses. Carlton admits it was unlike his normal self not to force the man to drive where he wanted, but he felt lulled, lazy, indifferent. Let the fool take his own way, his thoughts ran. I shan't pay him any more for it. Somebody was waving to him from the pavement with a colored parasol. A girl he knew, one of his sort. Gay and smiling, tripping along quickly. With a momentary surprise that she should be thus early astir, he smiled through the window and waved his hand. It gave him pleasure to see she was going in the same direction as himself. The instant he passed her, the horse leaped forward with increased speed, so that the hansom rattled, shaking him a little as it lurched from side to side. "Steady on, idiot," he shouted, "or you'll smash me up before I get to the end." And he was just going to bang open the trap and swear when his attention was caught by another salutation from the pavement. It was a man this time, running hard. A man who played, drank, and the rest of it even harder than himself. A man who shared his trips to Paris. He was radiant and gesticulating. "Good journey, old man," he heard him cry as the hansom shot past. "Hurry up! We're coming too! We shall be there together!" Carlton did not quite like this greeting. It reminded him for a second that he was a bit uncertain where the mad driver was heading for. It gave him a passing uneasiness, almost immediately forgotten, however. The pace was too delicious to bring to an end just yet. Presently he would call the fellow to order with a vengeance, but meanwhile, let her rip! His friends were all going the same way. It must be all right. His thoughts, he admits, were somewhat mixed, for great speed destroys calm judgment. It exhilarated, but it also bewildered. The pace, assuredly, had something to do with his mental confusion, for it was terrific. Yet he saw on the pavement, from time to time, more friends and acquaintances, and somehow at the moment it did not strike him as too peculiar that they should be there, all moving hurriedly in the same direction. He had an odd feeling that they all knew of some destination agreed upon, that he too knew it, but that it was not playing the game to admit that he knew. Yet, about some of them, their hurried steps, their gay faces, their waving hands, There was a queer, fugitive suggestion of sadness, even of fear. One or two touched the source of horror in him, even. It hardly surprised him that the horse, steaming and sweating, should start forward with a frightened leap as each figure in turn was sighted and left behind. Probably he was himself too much a part of the wild, exhilarating rush to realize how singular it was. Certainly it seemed as though some faculty of his mind was suspended during that drive. But at last, after passing another friend, the horse gave a leap that really frightened him, flinging him against the boards. It was a man twice his own age, who more than any other had helped him in his evil living, not by doing likewise, but by smothering his first remorse with a smile and a sentence. "Of course, my boy, sow your wild oats. You'll settle down later. No man is worth his salt who hasn't sown his wild oats." He was sliding along, a kind of crawl, with something loathsome to his motion that suggested the reptile. Carlton nodded to him. The same second the horse gave its terrible bound. The whip, for the first time, slashed down across its flanks. He saw the strip of crepe, black against the green and sunny landscape. For by now all houses were left behind, and they were rushing at a mad pace along a broad country road, growing momentarily steeper and downhill. At the same moment he caught his own face in the glass. To his utter horror he saw that a black veil, crepe-like, hung over the upper part, already hiding the eyes, and that it was moving downwards, slowly creeping. The hand of steel turned again within him. He knew that it was death. Yet, most singular of all, he instantly found in himself the power to believe it was not there. His hand brushed it off. His face was young, clean, and smiling once more. And now the hansom flew. The horse was running away. He heard the driver shouting to it, and the shouting sounded like a song. The man was drunk, after all. Mingled with his song, too, came a confused murmur of voices behind, far away. What in the world did it all mean? Dashing aside the little curtain, he looked back out of the window, and the first thing he saw was a face pressed close against the glass, staring straight into his eyes with a beseeching, pitiful expression. Good God! It was the face of his mother. He swore. The face melted away. And then he saw the whole country behind him was black, and through it, down the darkened road, ran the figures he had passed. But how changed! The girl was no longer gay and smiling. Her face was old, streaked with evil, and with one hand she clutched her heart as she ran, trying in vain to stop. Behind her were the others, worn and broken, with bloodshot eyes and toothless gums, all grinning dreadfully, all racing down the ever-steepening descent, yet all trying frantically to stop. One or two, however, still ran with a brave show as if they wished to, debonair, holding themselves with a certain appearance of dignity and pleasure. And some, the old man of the wild oats sentence at their head, were close upon the hansom, pushing it. The face of his mother slid once again upon the glass, between their evil outstretched hands and himself, but less close, less visible than before. Carlton knew a spasm of pain that was terrible. He sat up. He flung open the doors, and his eyes measured the leap. But the faculty of mind that had all the time been in suspension returned a little, and he saw that to jump was impossible. He smashed the trap open with his fist and cried out, "Stop! I tell you, stop!" "Can't stop here, sir," the driver answered, peering down at him out of the square opening that let in darkness. "It's not allowed. It's not usual, either." "Stop, I say!" thundered Carlton, trying to rise and strike him. But the driver laughed through that square of blackness. "Can't be done, sir. You told me same address. There's no stopping now." Carlton's clenched fist was close to the man's eyes when the fingers grew limp and opened. He sank back upon the seat again. The face peering down upon him was his own. And in the supreme moment it was that some secret reserve of soul hitherto untainted, stirred into life, he declares, by the sight of his mother's face at the window, rose and offered itself to him. He accepted it. His will moved in its sleep and woke. "But I say you shall stop," he cried, catching the reins in both hands and, when they snapped, seizing the rims and even the spokes of the wheels. His great strength acted like a brake. The hansom reeled, shook, then slackened. It was a most curious thing, but the force that twisted his heart with its hand of ragged steel seemed to lend him its power. His will moved and gripped. The machinery groaned, but worked. Carlton did nothing by halves. He put his life into his efforts. The skin was torn like paper from his hands. The hansom stopped with a trembling jerk and flung him out upon his face in the mud. And the same second he saw the horse and driver, both torn from their fastenings, whirled past him overhead to disappear into a gulf that yawned dreadfully under his very eyes, blacker than night, deeper than all things. And when, at length, he rose to his feet, he found that he was tied with bands of iron to the shafts. Slowly, with vast efforts, groaning and sweating, he turned and began painfully to reclimb the huge and toilsome ascent, dragging the awful weight behind him, towards the light. For the glare that suddenly broke through the sky was the sunshine coming through the windows of the hospital room, St. George's Hospital, where they had carried him when he fainted on the pavement half an hour before. End of section 11. Section 12 of The Lost Valley and Other Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eccentricity of Simon Parnacute. 1. It was one of those mornings in early spring when even the London streets run beauty. The day, passing through the sky with clouds of flying hair, touched everyone with the magic of its own irresponsible gaiety, as it alternated between laughter and the tears of sudden showers. In the parks, the trees, faintly clothed with gauze, were busying themselves shyly with the thoughts of coming leaves. The air held a certain sharpness, but the sun swam through the dazzling blue spaces with bursts of almost summer heat, and a wind, straight from the haunted south, laid its soft persuasion upon all, bringing visions too fair to last. Long thoughts of youth, of cowslip meadows, white sails, waves on yellow sand, and other pictures innumerable and enchanting. So potent indeed was this spell of awakening spring that even Simon Parnacute, retired professor of political economy, elderly, thin-faced, and ruminating in his big skull those large questions that concern the polity of nations, formed no exception to the general rule. For as he slowly made his way down the street that led from his apartment to the little park, he was fully aware that this magic of the spring was in his own blood too, and that the dust, which had accumulated with the years upon the surface of his soul, was being stirred by one of the softest breezes he had ever felt in the whole course of his arduous and tutorial career. And it so happened, just as he reached the foot of the street where the houses fell away towards the open park, the sun rushed out into one of the sudden blue spaces of the sky, and drenched him in a wave of delicious heat that for all the world was like the heat of July. Professor Parnacute, once lecturer, now merely ponderer, was an exact thinker, dealing carefully with the facts of life as he saw them. He was a good man, and true. He dealt in large emotions, becoming for one who studied nations rather than individuals, and of all diplomacies of the heart he was rudely ignorant. He lived always at the center of the circle, his own circle, and eccentricity was a thing to him utterly abhorrent. Convention ruled him, body, soul, and mind. To know a disordered thought or an unwanted emotion troubled him as much as to see a picture crooked on a wall, or a man's collar projecting beyond his overcoat. Eccentricity was the symptom of a disease. Thus, as he reached the foot of the street and felt the sun and wind upon his withered cheeks, this unexpected call of the spring came to him sharply as something altogether out of place and illegitimate, symptom of an irregular condition of mind that must be instantly repressed. And it was just here, while the crowd jostled and delayed him, that there smote upon his ear the song incarnate of the very spring whose spell he was in the act of relegating to its proper place in his personal economy. He heard the entrancing singing of a bird. Transfixed with wonder and delight, he stood for a whole minute and listened. Then, slowly turning, he found himself staring straight into the small beseeching eyes of a thrush in a cage that hung upon the outside wall of a bird fancier's shop behind him. Perhaps he would not have lingered more than these few seconds, however, had not the crowd held him momentarily prisoner in a spot immediately opposite the shop, where his head, too, was exactly on a level with the hanging cage. Thus he was perforce obliged to stand and watch and listen. And as he did so, the bird's rapturous and appealing song played upon the feelings already awakened by the spring, urging them upwards and outwards to a point that grew perilously moving. Both sound and sight caught and held him spellbound. The bird, once well-favored perhaps, he perceived was now thin and bedraggled, its feathers disarrayed by continual flitting along its perch, and by endless fluttering of wings and body against the bars of its narrow cage. There was not room to open both wings properly. It frequently dashed itself against the sides of its wooden prison, and all the force of its vain and passionate desire for freedom shone in the two small and glittering eyes which gazed beseechingly through the bars at the passers-by. It looked broken and worn with the ceaseless renewal of the futile struggle. Hopping along the bar, cocking its dainty little head on one side and looking straight into the professor's eyes, it managed, by some inarticulate magic known only to the eyes of creatures in prison, to spell out the message of its pain, the poignant longing for the freedom of the open sky, the lift of the great winds, the glory of the sun upon its lustreless feathers. Now it so chanced that this combined onslaught of sight and sound caught the elderly professor along the line of least resistance, the line of an untried and therefore unexhausted sensation. Here, apparently, was an emotion hitherto unrealized, and so not yet regulated away into atrophy. For, with an intuition as singular as it was searching, he suddenly understood something of the passion of the wild, caged things of the world, and realized in a flash of passing vision something of their unutterable pain. In one swift movement of genuine mystical sympathy, he felt with their peculiar quality of unsatisfied longing exactly as though it were his own, the longing not only of captive birds and animals, but of anguished men and women, trapped by circumstance, confined by weakness, cabined by character and temperament, all yearning for a freedom they knew not how to reach, caged by the smallness of their desires, by the impotence of their wills, by the pettiness of their souls, caged in bodies from which death alone could finally bring release. Something of all this found its way into the elderly professor's heart as he stood watching the pantomime of the captive thrush, the caged thing, and after a moment's hesitation that represented a vast amount of condensed feeling, he deliberately entered the low doorway of the shop and inquired the price of the bird.
"The thrush, singing in the small cage," he stammered.
1 and 6 only, sir," replied the coarse, red-faced man who owned the shop, looking up from a rabbit that he was pushing with clumsy fingers into a box. "Only 1 shilling and 6 pence," and then went on with copious remarks upon thrushes in general, and the superior qualities of this one in particular. "Been here 4 months and sings just lovely," he added by way of climax.
"Thank you," said Parnacute quietly, trying to persuade himself that he did not feel mortified by his impulsive and eccentric action. "Then I will purchase the bird at once, if you please."
"Couldn't go far wrong, sir," said the man, shoving the rabbit to one side and going outside to fetch the thrush.
"No, I shall not require the cage, but you may put him in a cardboard box, perhaps, so that I can carry him easily."
He referred to the bird as him, though at any other time he would have said it, and the change, noted surreptitiously as it were, added to his general sense of confusion. It was too late, however, to alter his mind, and after watching the man force the bird with gross hands into a cardboard box, He gathered up the noose of string with which it was tied and walked with as much dignity and self-respect as he could muster out of the shop. But the moment he got into the street with this living parcel under his arm, he both heard and felt the scuttling of the bird's feet. The realization that he had been guilty of what he considered an outrageous act of eccentricity almost overwhelmed him, for he had succumbed in most regrettable fashion to a momentary impulse, and had bought the bird in order to release it. "Dear me," he thought, "however could I have allowed myself to do so eccentric and impulsive a thing?" And, but for the fact that it would merely have accentuated his eccentricity, he would then and there have returned to the shop and given back the bird. That, however, being now clearly impossible, he crossed the road and entered the little park by the first iron gateway he could find. He walked down the gravel path, fumbling with the string. In another minute the bird would have been out, when he chanced to glance round in order to make sure he was unobserved, and saw against the shrubbery on his left a policeman. This, he felt, was most vexatious, for he had hoped to complete the transaction unseen. Straightening himself up, he nervously fastened the string again, and walked on slowly as though nothing had happened, searching for a more secluded spot where he should be entirely free from observation. Professor Parnacute now became aware that his vexation, primarily caused by his active impulse, and increased by the fact that he was observed, had become somewhat acute. It was extraordinary, he reflected, how policemen had this way of suddenly outlining themselves in the least appropriate, the least necessary places. There was no reason why a policeman should have been standing against that innocent shrubbery, where there was nothing to do, no one to watch. At almost any other point in the little park, he might have served some possibly useful purpose, and yet, forsooth, he must select the one spot where he was not wanted, where his presence, indeed, was positively objectionable. The policeman meanwhile watched him steadily as he retreated with the obnoxious parcel. He carried it upside down now without knowing it. He felt as though he had been detected in a crime. He watched the policeman, too, out of the corner of his eye, longing to be done with the whole business. "That policeman is a tremendous fellow," he thought to himself. "I have never seen a constable so large, so stalwart. He must be the policeman of the district, whatever that might mean, a veritable wall and tower of defense." The helmet made him think of a battering ram, and the buttons on his overcoat of the muzzles of guns. He moved away round the corner with as much innocence as he could assume, as though he were carrying a package of books or some new article of apparel. It is no doubt the duty of every alert constable to observe as acutely as possible the course of events passing before his eyes, yet this particular bobby seemed far more interested than the circumstances warranted in Parnacute's cardboard box. He kept his gaze remorselessly upon it. Perhaps, thought the professor, he heard the scutterings of the frightened bird within. Perhaps he thought it was a cat going to be drowned in the ornamental water. Perhaps, oh, dreadful idea, he thought it was a baby. The suspicions of an intelligent policeman, however, being past finding out, Simon Parnacute wisely ignored them, and just then passed round a corner where he was screened from this persistent observer by a dense growth of rhododendron bushes. Seizing the opportune moment and acting with a prompt decision born out of dread of the reappearing policeman, he cut the string, opened the lid of the box, and an instant later had the intense satisfaction of seeing the imprisoned thrush hop upon the cardboard edge and then fly with a beautiful curving dip and a whir of wings off into the open sky. It turned once as it flew, and its bright brown eye looked at him. Then it was gone, lost in the sunshine that blazed over the shrubberies and beckoned it out over their waving tops across the river. The prisoner was free. For the space of a whole minute, the professor stood still, conscious of a sense of genuine relief. That sound of wings, that racing sweep of the little quivering body escaping into limitless freedom, that penetrating look of gratitude from the wee brown eyes, these stirred in him again the same prodigious emotion he had experienced for the first time that afternoon outside the bird fancier's shop. The release of the caged creature provided him with a kind of vicarious experience of freedom and delight, such as he had never before known in his whole life. It almost seemed as though he had escaped himself, out of his circle. Then, as he faced about, with the empty box dangling in his hand, the first thing he saw coming slowly down the path towards him with measured tread was the big policeman. Something very stern, something very forbidding, hung like an atmosphere of warning about this guardian of the law in a blue uniform. It brought him back sharply to the rigid facts of life, and the soft beauty of the spring day vanished and left him untouched. He accepted the reminder that life is earnest, and that eccentricities are invitations to disaster. Sooner or later the policeman is bound to make his appearance. However, this particular constable, of course, passed him without a word or gesture, and as soon as he came to one of the little wire baskets provided for the purpose, the professor dropped his box into it, and then made his way slowly and thoughtfully back to his apartment and his luncheon. But the eccentricity of which he had been guilty circled and circled in his mind, reminding him with merciless insistence of a foolish act he should not have committed, and plaguing him with remorseless little stabs for having indulged in an impulsive and irregular proceeding. For to him the inevitableness of life came as a fact to which he was resigned, rather than as a force to be appropriated for the ends of his own soul. And the sight of the happy bird escaping into sky and sunshine, with the figure of the inflexible and stern-lipped policeman in the background, made a deep impression upon him that would sooner or later be certain to bear fruit. "Dear me," thought the professor of political economy, giving mental expression to this sentiment, "I shall pay for this in the long run. Without question, I shall pay for it." If it may be taken that there is no chance, playing tricksy-wise behind the scenes of existence, but that all events falling into the lives of men are the calculated results of adequate causes, then Mr. Simon Parnacute, late professor of political economy in College, certainly did pay for his spring aberration, in the sense that he caught a violent chill which brought him to bed and speedily developed into pneumonia. It was the evening of the 6th day, and he lay weary and feverish in his bedroom on the top floor of the building which held his little self-contained apartment. The nurse was downstairs having her tea. A shaded lamp stood beside the bed, and through the window, the blinds being not yet drawn, he saw the sea of roofs and chimney-pots, and the stream of wires sharply outlined against a sunset sky of gold and pink. High and thin above the dusk floated long strips of colored cloud, and the first stars twinkled through the April vapors that gathered with the approach of night. Presently the door opened, and someone came in softly halfway across the room, and then stopped. The professor turned wearily and saw that the maid stood there and was trying to speak. She seemed flustered, he noticed, and her face was rather white. "What's the matter now, Emily?" he asked feebly yet irritably.
"Please, Professor, there's a gentleman—"
And there she stuck.
"Someone to see me? The doctor again already?"
queried the patient, wondering in a vague, absent way why the girl should seem so startled. As he spoke, there was a sound of footsteps on the landing outside. Heavy footsteps.
"But please, Professor, sir, it's not the doctor,"
the maid faltered.
"Only I couldn't get his name, and I couldn't stop him, and he said you expected him, and I think he looks like—"
The approaching footsteps frightened the girl so much that she could not find words to complete her description. They were just outside the door now.
"Like a policeman,"
she finished with a rush, backing towards the door as though she feared the professor would leap from his bed to demolish her. "A policeman!" gasped Mr. Parnacute, unable to believe his ears. "A policeman, Emily, in my apartment!" And before the sick man could find words to express his particular annoyance that any stranger, above all a constable, should intrude at such a time, the door was pushed wide open, the girl had vanished with a flutter of skirts, and the tall figure of a man stood in full view upon the threshold, and stared steadily across the room at the occupant of the bed on the other side. It was indeed a policeman, and a very large policeman. Moreover, it was the policeman. The instant the professor recognized the familiar form of the man from the park, his anger, for some quite unaccountable reason, vanished almost entirely. The sharp vexation he had felt a moment before died away, and sinking back exhausted among the pillows, he only found breath to ask him to close the door and come in. The fact was, astonishment had used up the small store of energy at his disposal, and for the moment he could think of nothing else to do. The policeman closed the door quietly and moved forward towards the center of the room, so that the circle of light from the shaded lamp at the head of the bed reached his figure, but fell just short of his face. The invalid sat up in bed again and stared. As nothing seemed to happen, he recovered his scattered wits a little.
"You are the policeman from the park, unless I mistake?"
he asked feebly, with mingled pomposity and resentment. The big man bowed in acknowledgment and removed his helmet, holding it before him in his hand. His face was peculiarly bright, almost as though it reflected the glow of a bull's-eye lantern concealed somewhere about his huge person.
"I thought I recognized you,"
went on the professor, exasperated a little by the other's self-possession.
"Are you perhaps aware that I am ill, too ill to see strangers, and that to force your way up in this fashion—"
He left the sentence unfinished for lack of suitable expletives.
"You are certainly ill,"
replied the constable, speaking for the first time.
"But then, I am not a stranger."
His voice was wonderfully pitched and modulated for a policeman.
"Then by what right, pray, do you dare to intrude upon me at such a time?"
snapped the other, ignoring the latter's statement.
"My duty, sir,"
the man replied with a rather wonderful dignity,
"knows nothing of time or place."
Professor Parnacute looked at him a little more closely as he stood there, helmet in hand. He was something more, he gathered, than an ordinary constable, an inspector, perhaps. He examined him carefully, but he understood nothing about differences in uniform, of bands or stars upon sleeve and collar.
"If you are here in the prosecution of your duty, then,"
exclaimed the man of careful mind, searching feverishly for some possible delinquency on the part of his small staff of servants,
"pray be seated and state your business, but as briefly as possible. My throat pains me, and my strength is low."
He spoke with less acerbity. The dignity of the visitor began to impress him in some vague fashion he did not understand. The big figure in blue bowed again, but made no sign of advance.
"You come from X station, I presume?"
Parnacute added, mentioning the police station round the corner. He sank deeper into his pillows, conscious that his strength was becoming exhausted.
"From headquarters I come," replied the Colossus in a deep voice.
The professor had only the vaguest idea what headquarters meant, yet the phrase conveyed an importance that somehow was not lost upon him. Meanwhile his impatience grew with his exhaustion.
"I must request you, officer, to state your business with dispatch," he said tartly, "or to come again when I am better able to attend you. Next week, no doubt."
"There is no time but the present," returned the other, with an odd choice of words that escaped the notice of his perplexed hearer, as he produced from a capacious pocket in the tail of his overcoat a notebook bound with some shining metal like gold. "Your name is Parnacute?" he added, consulting the book.
"Yes,"
answered the other, with the resignation of exhaustion. "Simon Parnacute?"
"Of course, yes."
"And on the 3rd of April last," he went on, looking keenly over the top of the notebook at the sick man, "you, Simon Parnacute, entered the shop of Theodore Spinks in the Lower P Road, and purchased from him a certain living creature."
"Yes,"
answered the professor, beginning to feel hot at the discovery of his folly. "A bird?"
"A bird."
"A thrush?"
"A thrush."
"A singing thrush?"
"Oh, yes, it was a singing thrush, if you must know."
"In money you paid for this thrush the sum of 1 shilling and 6 pennies. He emphasized the "and," just as the bird fancier had done.
1 and 6, yes.
"But in true value," said the policeman, speaking with grave emphasis, "it cost you a great deal more."
"Perhaps."
He winced internally at the memory. He was so astonished, too, that the visitor had to do with himself and not with some of his servants. "You paid for it with your heart," insisted the other. The professor made no reply. He started. He almost writhed under the sheets. "Am I right?" asked the policeman. "That is the fact, I suppose," he said in a low voice, sorely puzzled by the catechism. "You carried this bird away in a cardboard box to E. Gardens by the river, and there you gave it freedom and watched it fly away." "Your statement is correct, I think, in every particular, but really, this absurd cross-examination, my good man." "And your motive in so doing," continued the policeman, his voice quite drowning the invalid's feeble tones, "was the unselfish one of releasing an imprisoned and tortured creature." Simon Parnacute looked up with the greatest possible surprise.
"I think... well, perhaps it was," he murmured apologetically. "The extraordinary singing. It was extraordinary, you know, and the sight of the little thing beating its wings pained me."
The big policeman put away his notebook suddenly and moved closer to the bed so that his face entered the circle of lamplight. "In that case," he cried, "you are my man."
"I am your man?" exclaimed the professor with an uncontrollable start.
"The man I want," repeated the other, smiling. His voice had suddenly grown soft and wonderful, like the ringing of a silver gong, and into his face had come an expression of wistful tenderness that made it positively beautiful. It shone. Never before out of a picture had he seen such a look upon a human countenance, or heard such tones issued from the lips of a human being. He thought swiftly and confusedly of a woman, of the woman he had never found, of a dream, an enchantment as of music or vision upon the senses. "Wants me?" he thought with alarm. "What have I done now? What new eccentricity have I been guilty of?" Strange, bewildering ideas crowded into his mind, blurred in outline, preposterous in character. A sensation of cold caught at his fever and overmastered it, bathing him in perspiration, making him tremble, yet not with fear. A new and curious delight had begun to pluck at his heartstrings. Then an extravagant suspicion crossed his brain, yet a suspicion not wholly unwarranted. "Who are you?" he asked sharply, looking up. "Are you really only a policeman?" The man drew himself up so that he appeared, if possible, even huger than before. "I am a world policeman," he answered. "A guardian, perhaps, rather than a detective." "Heavens above!" cried the professor, thinking of madness and the crimes committed in madness. "Yes," he went on in those calm musical tones that before long began to have a reassuring effect upon his listener. "And it is my duty, among many others, to keep an eye upon eccentric people, to lock them up when necessary, and when their sentences have expired, to release them. Also," he added impressively, "as in your case, to let them out of their cages without pain, when they've earned it." "Gracious goodness me!" exclaimed Parnacute, unaccustomed to the use of expletives, but unable to think of anything else to say. "And sometimes to see that their cages do not destroy them, and that they do not beat themselves to death against the bars," he went on, smiling quite wonderfully. "Our duties are varied and numerous. I am one of a large force." The man learned in political economy felt as though his head were spinning. He thought of calling for help. Indeed, he had already made a motion with his hand towards the bell, when a gesture on the part of his strange visitor restrained him. "Then why do you want me, if I may ask?" he faltered instead. "To mark you down, and when the time comes, to let you out of your cage easily, comfortably, without pain. That's one reward for your kindness to the bird." The professor's fears had now quite disappeared. The policeman seemed perfectly harmless after all. "It's very kind of you," he said feebly, drawing his arm back beneath the bedclothes. "Only I was not aware exactly that I lived in a cage." He looked up resignedly into the man's face. "You only realize that when you get out," he replied. "They're all like that. The bird didn't quite understand what was wrong. It only knew that it felt miserable. Same with you. You feel unhappy in that body of yours, and in that little, careful mind you regulate so nicely. But for the life of you, you don't quite know what it is that's wrong. You want space, freedom, a taste of liberty. You want to fly. That's what you want?" he cried, raising his voice. "I want to fly?" gasped the invalid. "Oh," smiling again, "we world policemen have thousands of cases just like yours. Our field is a large one, a very large one indeed." He stepped into the light more fully and turned sideways. "Here's my badge if you care to see it," he said proudly. He stooped a little so that the professor's beady eyes could easily focus themselves upon the collar of his overcoat. There, just like the lettering upon the collar of an ordinary London policeman, only in bright gold instead of silver, shone the constellation of the Pleiades. Then he turned and showed the other side, and Parnacute saw the constellation of Orion slanting upwards, as he had often seen it tilting across the sky at night. "Those are my badges," he repeated proudly, straightening himself up again and moving back into the shadow. "And very fine they are, too," said the professor, his increasing exhaustion suggesting no better observation. But with the sight of those starry figures had come to him a strange whiff of the open skies, space and wind, the winds of the world. "So that when the time comes," the world policeman resumed, "you may have confidence. I will let you out without pain or fear, just as you let out the bird. And meanwhile you may as well realize that you live in a cage just as cramped and shut away from light and freedom as the thrush did." "Thank you. I will certainly try," whispered Parnacute, almost fainting with fatigue. There followed a pause during which the policeman put on his helmet, tightened his belt, and then began to search vigorously for something in his coat-tail pockets. "And now," ventured the sick man, feeling half fearful, half happy, though without knowing exactly why, "is there anything more I can do for you, Mr. World Policeman?" He was conscious that his words were peculiar, yet he could not help it. They seemed to slip out of their own accord. "There's nothing more you can do for me, sir, thank you," answered the man in his most silvery tones. "But there's something more I can do for you, and that is to give you a preliminary taste of freedom, so that you may realize you do live in a cage, and be less confused and puzzled when you come to make the final escape." Parnacute caught his breath sharply, staring open-mouthed. With a single stride the policeman covered the space between himself and the bed. Before the withered, fever-stricken little professor could utter a word or a cry, he had caught up the wasted body out of the bed, shaken the bedclothes off him like paper from a parcel, and slung him without ceremony across his gigantic shoulders. Then he crossed the room, and producing the key from his coat-tail pocket, he put it straight into the solid wall of the room. He turned it, and the entire side of the house opened like a door. For 1 second Simon Parnacute looked back and saw the lamp, and the fire, and the bed. And in the bed he saw his own body lying motionless in profound slumber. Then, as the policeman balanced, hovering upon the giddy edge, he looked outward and saw the network of street lamps far below, and heard the deep roar of the city smite upon his ears like the thunder of a sea. The next moment the man stepped out into space, and he saw that they were rising up swiftly towards the dark vault of the sky, where the stars twinkled down upon them between streaks of thin flying clouds. 3. Once outside, floating in the night, the policeman gave his shoulder a mighty jerk and tossed his small burden into free space. "Jump away!" he cried. "You're quite safe!" The professor dropped like a bullet towards the pavement, then suddenly began to rise again, like a balloon. All traces of fever or bodily discomfort had left him utterly. He felt light as air and strong as lightning. "Now where shall we go to?" the voice sounded above him. Simon Parnacute was no flyer. He had never indulged in those strange flying dreams that form a weird pleasure in the sleep lives of many people. He was terrified beyond belief until he found that he did not crash against the earth, and that he had within him the power to regulate his movements, to rise or sink at will. Then, of course, the wildest fury of delight and freedom he had ever known flashed all over him, and burned in his brain like an intoxication. "The big cities or the stars?" asked the world policeman.
No, no, he cried. The country, the open country, and other lands.
For Simon Parnacute had never traveled. Incredible as it may seem, the professor had never in his life been farther out of England than in a sailing boat at Southend. His body had traveled even less than his imagination. With this suddenly increased capacity for motion, the desire to race about and see became a passion.
Woods, mountains, seas, deserts, anything but houses and people,
he shouted, rising upwards to his companion without the smallest effort. An intense longing to see the desolate, unfrequented regions of the earth seized him and tore its way out into words strangely unlike his normal and measured mode of speech. All his life he had paced to and fro in a formal little garden with the most precise paths imaginable. Now he wanted a trackless world. The reaction was terrific. The desire of the Arab for the desert, of the gypsy for the open heaths, the desire of the snipe for the wilderness. The longing of the eternal wanderer possessed his soul and found vent in words. It was just as though the passion of the released thrush were reproducing itself in him and becoming articulate.
I am haunted by the faces of the world's forgotten places, he cried aloud impetuously. Beaches lying in the moonlight, all forsaken in the moonlight.
His utterance, like the bird's, had become lyrical.
Can this be what the thrush felt? He wondered.
Let's be off, then, the policeman called back. There's no time but the present, remember. He rushed through space like a huge projectile. He made a faint whistling noise as he went. Parnacute followed suit. The lightest desire he found gave him instantly the ease and speed of thought. The policeman had taken off his helmet, overcoat, and belt, and dropped them down somewhere in a London street. He now appeared as a mere blue outline of a man, scarcely discernible against the dark sky, an outline filled with air. The professor glanced down at himself and saw that he too was a mere outline of a man, a pallid outline filled with the purple air of night. Now then, sang out this Bobby of the world. Side by side they shot up with a wild rush, and the lights of London, town, and suburbs flashed away beneath them in streaming lines and patches. In a second, darkness filled the huge gap, pouring behind them like a mighty wave. Other streams and patches of light succeeded quickly, blurred and faint, like lamps of railway stations from a night express, as other towns dropped past them in a series and were swallowed up in the gulf behind. A cool salt air smote their faces, and Parnacute heard the soft crashing of waves as they crossed the channel and swept on over the fields and forests of France, glimmering below like the squares of a mighty chessboard. Like toys, village after village shot by, smelling of peat smoke, cattle, and the faint windiness of coming spring. Sometimes they passed below the clouds and lost the stars, sometimes above them and lost the world. Sometimes over forests, roaring like the sea, sometimes above vast plains, still and silent as the grave. But always Parnacute saw the constellations of Orion and Pleiades shining on the coat-collar of the soaring policeman, their little patterns picked out as with tiny electric lamps. Below them lay the huge map of the earth, raised, scarred, darkly colored and breathing, a map alive. Then came the Jura, soft and purple, carpeted with forests rolling below them like a dream, and they looked down into slumbering valleys and heard far below the tumbling of water and the singing of countless streams.
Glory, glory, cried the professor. And do the birds know this?
Not the imprisoned ones, was the reply. And presently they whipped across large gleaming bodies of water as the lakes of Switzerland approached. Then, entering the zones of icy atmosphere, they looked down and saw white towers and pinnacles of silver, and the forms of scarred and mighty glaciers that rose and fell among the fields of eternal snow, folding upon the mountains in vast procession.
"I think I'm frightened,"
gasped Parnacute, clutching at his companion, but seizing only the frigid air. The policeman shouted with laughter. "This is nothing compared to Mars or the moon," he cried, soaring till the Alps looked like a patch of snowdrops shining in a Surrey garden. "You'll soon get accustomed to it." The professor of political economy rose after him, but presently they sank again in an immense curving sweep and touched the tops of the highest mountains with their toes. This sent them instantly aloft again, bounding with the impetus of rockets, and so they careered on through the perfumed pathless night, till they came to Italy and left the Alps behind them like the shadowy wall of another world that had silently moved up close to them through the space.
"Mother of mountains!" shouted the delighted man of colleges. "And did the thrush know this too?"
"It has you to thank if so," the policeman answered.
"And I have you to thank."
"No, yourself," replied his flying guide. And then the desert. They had crossed the scented Mediterranean and reached the zones of sand. It rose in clouds and sheets, as a mighty wind stirred across the leagues of loneliness that stretched below them into blue distance. It whirled about them and stung their faces.
"Thin ropes of sand which crumble ere they bind,"
cried the professor with a peal of laughter, not knowing what he said in the delirium of his pleasure. The hot smell of the sand excited him. The knowledge that for hundreds of miles he could not see a house or a human being thrilled him dizzily with the incalculable delight of freedom. The splendor of the night, mystical and incommunicable, overcame him. He rose, laughing wildly, shaking the sand from his hair and taking gigantic curves into the starry space about him. He remembered vividly the sight of those bedraggled wings in the little cramped cage, and then looked down and realized that here the winds sank exhausted from the very weariness of too much space. Oh, that he could tear away the bars of every cage the world had ever known, set free all captive creatures, restore to all wild, winged life the liberty of open spaces that is theirs by right. He cried again to the stars and winds and deserts, but his words found no intelligible expression, for their passion was too great to be confined in any known medium. The world policeman alone understood, perhaps, for he flew down in circles round the little professor, and laughed and laughed and laughed. And it seemed as if tremendous figures formed themselves out of the sky to listen, and bent down to lift him with a single sweep of their immense arms from the earth to the heavens. Such was the torrential power and delight of escape in him, that he almost felt as if he could skim the icy abysses of death itself without being ever caught. The colossal shapes of Egypt, terrible and monstrous, passed far below in huge and shadowy procession, and the desolate Libyan mountains drew him hovering over their wastes of stone. And this was only a beginning. Asia, India, and the southern seas all lay within reach. All could be visited in turn. The interstellar spaces, the far planets, and the white moon were yet to know. "We must be thinking of turning soon," he heard the voice of his companion, and then remembered how his own body, hot and feverish, lay in that stuffy little room at the other end of Europe. It was indeed caged, the withered body in the room, and himself in the withered body, doubly caged. He laughed and shuddered. The wind swept through him, licking him clean. He rose again in the ecstasy of free flight, following the lead of the policeman on the homeward journey, and the mountains below became a purple line on the map. In a series of great sweeps they rested on the top of the pyramid, and then upon the earth at intervals, till they heard once more the waves upon the coastline, and soared aloft again across the sea, racing through Spain and over the Pyrenees. The thin blue outline of the policeman kept ever at his side. "From all the far blue hills of heaven these winds of freedom blow," he shouted into space, following it with a peal of laughter that made his guide circle round and round him, chuckling as he flew. A curious silvery chuckle it was, yet it sounded as though it came to him through a much greater distance than before. It came, as it were, through barriers. The picture of the bird fancier's shop came again vividly before him. He saw the beseeching and frightened little eyes, heard the ceaseless pattering of the imprisoned feet, wings beating against the bars, and soft furry bodies pushing vainly to get out. He saw the red face of Theodore Spinks, the proprietor, gloating over the scene of captive life that gave him the means to live, the means to enjoy his own little measure of freedom. He saw the seagull drooping in its corner, and the owl, its eyes filled with the dust of the street, its feathered ears twitching. And then he thought again of the caged human beings of the world, men, women, and children, and a pain, like the pain of a whole universe, burned in his soul and set his heart aflame with yearning, to set them all instantly free. And unable to find words to give expression to what he felt, he found relief again in his strange, impetuous singing. Simon Parnacute, professor of political economy, sang in mid-heaven. But this was the last vivid memory he knew. It all began to fade a little after that. It changed swiftly, like a dream when the body nears the point of waking. He tried to seize and hold it, to delay the moment when it must end, but the power was beyond him. He felt heavy and tired, and flew closer to the ground. The intervals between the curves of flight grew smaller and smaller, the impetus weaker and weaker as he became every moment more dense and stupid. His progress across the fields of the south of England as he made his way almost laboriously homewards became rather a series of long, low leaps than actual flight. More and more often he found himself obliged to touch the earth to acquire the necessary momentum. The big policeman seemed suddenly to have quite melted away into the blue of night. Then he heard a door open in the sky over his head. A star came down rather too close and half blinded his eyes. Instinctively he called for help to his friend, the world policeman.
"It's time for your soup now,"
was the only answer he got, and it did not seem the right answer or the right voice either. A terror of being permanently lost came over him, and he cried out again louder than before.
"And the medicine first,"
dropped the thin, shrill voice out of endless space. It was not the policeman's voice at all. He knew now and understood. A sensation of weariness, of sickening disgust and boredom came over him. He looked up. The sky had turned white. He saw curtains and walls, and a bright lamp with a red shade. This was the star that had nearly blinded him. A lamp merely, in a sick room. And standing at the farther end of the room, he saw the figure of the nurse in cap and apron. Below him lay his body in the bed. His sensation of disgust and boredom became a positive horror, but he sank down exhausted into it, into his cage.
"Take this soup, sir, after the medicine, and then perhaps you'll get another bit of sleep,"
the nurse was saying with gentle authority, bending over him. 4. The progress of Professor Parnacute towards recovery was slow and tedious, for the illness had been severe, and it left him with a dangerously weak heart. And at night he still had the delights of the flying dreams. Only by this time he had learned to fly alone. His phantom friend, the big world policeman, no longer accompanied him. And his chief occupation during these weary hours of convalescence was curious and, the nurse considered, not very suitable for an invalid, for he spent the time with endless calculations, poring over the list of his few investments, and adding up times without number the total of his savings of nearly 40 years. The bed was strewn with papers and documents. Pencils were always getting lost among the clothes, and each time the nurse collected the paraphernalia and put them aside, he would wait till she was out of the room, and then crawl over to the table and carry them all back into bed with him. Then finally she gave up fighting with him and acquiesced, for his restlessness increased, and he could not sleep unless his beloved half-sheets and pencils lay strewn upon the counterpane within instant reach. Even to the least observant it was clear that the professor was hatching the preliminary details of a profound plot. And his very first visitor, as soon as he was permitted to see anybody, was a gentleman with parchment skin and hard, dry, peeping eyes, who came by special request, a solicitor from the firm of Messrs. Costa and Delay. "I will ascertain the price of the shop and stock in trade, and inform you of the result at the earliest opportunity, Professor Parnacute," said the man of law in his gritty professional voice, as he at length took his departure and left the sick-room with the expressionless face of one to whom the eccentricities of human nature could never be new or surprising.
"Thank you. I shall be most anxious to hear,"
replied the other, turning in his long easy-chair to save his papers, and at the same time to defend himself against the chiding of the good-natured nurse.
"I knew I should have to pay for it,"
he murmured, thinking of his original sin.
"but I hope—"
Here he again consulted his penciled figures.
"I think I can manage it, just. Though with consols so low—"
He fell to musing again.
"Still, I can always sublet the shop, of course, as they suggest,"
he concluded with a sigh, turning to appeal to the bewildered nurse, and finding for the first time that she had gone out of the room. He fell to pondering deeply. Presently the list enclosed by the solicitors caught his eye among the pillows, and he began listlessly to examine it. It was typewritten and covered several sheets of foolscap. It was split up into divisions headed as Lot 1, Lot 2, Lot 3, and so on. He began to read slowly, half aloud to himself, then with increasing excitement.
50 linnets, guaranteed not straight from the fields, all caged. 10 fierce singing linnets. 10 grand cock throstles, just on song. 5 pear-tree goldfinches with deep square blazes, well buttoned and mooned. 4 Devonshire woodlarks, guaranteed full song, caged 3 months. The professor sat up and gripped the paper tightly. His face wore a pained, intent expression. A convulsive movement of his fingers, automatic perhaps, crumpled the sheet and nearly tore it across. He went on reading, shedding rugs and pillows as though they oppressed him. His breathing came a little faster. 5 cock blackbirds, full plumage, lovely songsters. 1 song thrush, show cage and hamper. Splendid whistler, picked bird. 1 beautiful large upstanding singing skylark, sings all day, been caged positively 5 months. Simon Parnacute uttered a curious little cry. It was deep down in his throat. He was conscious of a burning desire to be rich, a millionaire, powerful, an autocratic monarch. After a pause, he brought back his attention with an effort to the typewritten page and the consideration of further lots. 3 cock skylarks, can hear them 200 yards off when singing. 200 yards off when singing, muttered the professor into his one remaining pillow. He read on, kicking his feet, somewhat viciously for a sick man, against the wicker rest at the end of the lounge chair. 1 special select singing cock skylark, guaranteed caged 3 months, sings his wild note. He suddenly dashed the list aside. The whole chair creaked and groaned with the violence of his movement. He kicked 3 times running at the wicker footrest, and evidently rejoiced that it was still stiff enough to make it worthwhile to kick again, harder. "Oh, that I had all the money in the world!" he cried to himself, letting his eyes wander to the window and the clear blue spaces between the clouds. "All the money in the world!" he repeated with growing excitement. He saw one of London's seagulls circling high, high up. He watched it for some minutes till it sailed against a dazzling bit of white cloud and was lost to view. "Sings his wild note. Guaranteed caged 3 months. Can be heard 200 yards off." The phrases burned in his brain like consuming flames. And so the list went on. He was glancing over the last page when his eye fell suddenly upon an item that described a lot of 8 linnets, caged 4 months, raving with song. He dropped the list, rose with difficulty from his chair and paced the room, muttering to himself, "Raving with song, raving with song, raving with song!" His hollow cheeks were flushed, his eyes aglow. "Caged, caged, caged!" he repeated under his breath, while his thoughts traveled to that racing flight across Europe, over seas and mountains. "Sings his wild note!" He heard again the whistling wind about his ears as he flew through the zones of heated air above the desert sands. "Raving with song!" He remembered the passion of his own cry.
that strange lyrical outburst of his heart when the magic of freedom caught him, and he had soared at will through the uncharted regions of the night. And then he saw once more the blinking owl, its eyes blinded by the dust of the London street, its feathery ears twitching as it heard the wind sighing past the open doorway of the dingy shop. And again the thrush looked into his face and poured out the rapture of its spring song. And half an hour later he was so exhausted by the unwonted emotion and exercise that the nurse herself was obliged to write at his dictation the letter he sent in reply to the solicitors, Messrs. Costa and Delay, in Southampton Row. But the letter was posted that night, and the professor, still mumbling to himself about having to pay for it, went to bed with the first hour of the darkness, and plunged straight into another of his delightful flying dreams almost the very moment his eyes had closed. 5. Thus all the animals have been disposed of according to your instructions, ran the final letter from the solicitors, and we beg to append list of items so allotted, together with country addresses to which they have been sent. We think you may feel assured that they are now in homes where they will be well cared for. We still retain the following animals against your further instructions: 2 Zonir lizards, 1 angulated tortoise, 2 mealy rosellas, 2 scaly-breasted lorikeets. With regard to these, we should advise... The caged birds, meanwhile, which you intend the children shall release, are being cared for satisfactorily, and the premises will be ready for taking over as from June 1st. And with the assistance of the nurse, he then began to issue a steady stream of letters to the parents of children he knew in the country, carefully noting and tabulating the replies, and making out little white labels inscribed in plain lettering with the words Lot 1, Lot 2, and so on, precisely as though he were in the animal business himself, and were getting ready for a sale. But the sale which took place a fortnight later on June 1st was no ordinary sale. It was a brilliant hot day when Simon Parnacute, still worn and shaky from his recent illness, made his way towards the shop of the retired bird fancier. The sale of the premises and stock in trade, and the high price obtained, had made quite a stir in the fancy, but of that the professor was sublimely ignorant as he crossed the street in front of a truculent motor omnibus and stood before the dingy 3-story red-brick house. He produced the key sent to him by Messrs. Costa and Delay and opened the door. It was cool after the glare of the burning street, and delightfully silent. He remembered the chorus of crying birds that had greeted his last appearance. The silence now was eloquent. Good, he said to himself, with a quiet smile as he noticed the temporary counter built across the front room for cloaks and parcels. Very good indeed. Then he went upstairs, climbing painfully, for he was still easily exhausted. There was hardly a stick of furniture in the house, nor an inch of carpet on the floor and stairs, but the rooms had been swept and scrubbed. Everything was fresh and scrupulously clean, and the tenant to whom he was to sublet could have no fault to find on that score. In the first-floor rooms he saw with pleasure the flowers arranged about the boards as he had directed. The air was sweet and perfumed. The windows at the back, the sills, deep with jars of roses, opened upon a small bit of green garden, and Parnacute looked out and saw the blue sky and the clouds floating lazily across it. Good, very good, he exclaimed again, sitting down on the stairs a moment to recover his breath. The excitement and the heat of the day tired him. And as he sat, he put his hand to his ear and listened attentively. A sound of birds singing reached him faintly from the upper part of the house. Ah, he said, drawing a deep breath, and color coming into his cheeks. Ah, now I hear them. The sound of singing came nearer, as on a passing wind. He climbed laboriously to the top floor, and then, after resting again, scrambled up a ladder through an open skylight on to the roof. The moment he put his perspiring face above the tiles, a wild chorus of singing birds greeted him with a sound like a whole countryside in spring. If only my friend the park policeman could see this, he said aloud with a delighted chuckle, and hear it! He sought a precarious resting place upon the butt of a chimney stack, mopping his forehead. All around him, the sea of London roofs and chimneys rolled away in a black sea. But here, like an oasis in a desert, was a roof of limited extent, and not very high compared to others, converted into a perfect garden. Flowers, but why describe them when he himself did not even know the names? It was enough that his orders had been carried out to his entire satisfaction, and that this little roof was a world of living color, moving in the wind, scenting the air, welcoming the sunshine. Everywhere among the pots and boxes of flowers stood the cages, and in the cages the thrushes and blackbirds, the larks and linnets, poured their hearts out with a chorus of song that was more exquisite, he thought, than anything he had ever heard. And there in the corner by the big chimney, carefully shaded from the glare, stood the large cage containing the owls. "I can almost believe they have guessed my purpose after all," exclaimed the professor. For a long time he sat there, leaning against the chimney, oblivious of a blackened collar, listening to the singing, and feasting his eyes upon the garden of flowers all about him. Then the sound of a bell ringing downstairs roused him suddenly into action, and he climbed with difficulty down again to the hall door. "Here they come," he thought, greatly excited. "Dear me, I do trust I shall not make any mistakes." He felt in his pocket for his notebook, and then opened the door into the street. "Oh, it's only you," he exclaimed as his nurse came in with her arms full of parcels.
"Only me," she laughed. "But I've brought the lemonade and the biscuits. The others will be here now any minute. It's after 3. There's just time to arrange the glasses and plates. We must expect about 50 according to the letters you got. And mind you don't get overtired."
"Oh, I'm all right," he answered. She ran upstairs. Before her steps had sounded once on the floor above, a carriage and pair stopped at the door, and a footman came up smartly and asked if Professor Parnacute was at home. "Indeed I am," answered the old man, blushing and laughing at the same time, and then going down himself to the carriage to welcome the little girl and boy who got out. He bowed stiffly and awkwardly to the pretty lady in the Victoria, who thanked him for his kindness with a speech he did not hear properly, and then led his callers into the house. They were very shy at first, and hardly knew what to make of it all, but once inside the boy's sense of adventure was stirred by the sight of the empty shop, and the counter, and the strange array of flowers upon the floor. He remembered the letter his father had read out from Professor Parnacute a week ago.
"My lot is number 7, isn't it, Mr. Professor?" he cried. "I let out a cage of linnets, and get a guinea pig and a mealy something or other as a present, don't I?"
Mr. Parnacute, shaky and beaming, consulted his notebook hurriedly, and replied that this was perfectly correct. "Master Edwin Burton," he read out, "to release Lot 7. To take away 1 guinea pig and 1 mealy rosella."
"I'm Lot 8, please,"
piped the voice of the little girl standing with wide-open eyes beside him. "Oh, are you, my dear?" said he. Yes, I believe you are." He fumbled anew with the notebook. "Here it is," he added, reading aloud again. "Miss Angelina Burton." He peered closely in the gloom to decipher the writing. "To release Lot 8. That's woodlarks, my dear, you know. To take away 1 angulated tortoise. Quite correct, yes, quite correct." He called to the nurse upstairs to show the children their presents hidden away in boxes among the flowers, their rosella and tortoise, and then went again to the door to receive his other guests, who now began to arrive in a steady stream. To the number of 20 or 30 they came, and not one of them appeared to be much over 12, and the majority of them left their elders at the door and came in unattended. The marshalling of this array of youngsters among the birds and flowers was a matter of some difficulty, but here the nurse came to the professor's assistance with energy and experience, so that his strength was economized and the children were arranged without danger to anyone. And upon that little roof the sight was certainly a unique one. There they all stood, an extraordinary patchwork of color for the tiles of southwest London, the bright frocks of the girls, the plumage of the birds, the blues and yellows and scarlets of the flowers, while the singing and voices sent up a chorus that brought numerous surprised faces to the windows of the higher buildings about them, and made people stop in the street below and ask themselves with startled faces where in the world these sounds came from this still June afternoon. "Now!" cried Simon Parnacute, when all lots and owners had been placed carefully side by side. "The moment I give the word of command,
Open your cages and let the prisoners escape, and point in the direction of the park."
The children stooped and picked up their cages. The voices and the singing in 100 busy little throats ceased. A hush fell upon the roof and upon the strange gathering. The sun poured blazingly down over everything, and the professor's face streamed.
"1,"
he cried, his voice tremulous with excitement.
"2, 3, and away!"
There was a rattling sound of opening doors and wire bars, and then a sudden burst of half-suppressed, long-drawn ahs, and at once there followed a rush of fluttering feathers, a rapid vibration of the air, and the small host of prisoners shot out like a cloud into the air, and a moment later, with a great whirring of wings, had disappeared over the walls beyond the forest of chimneys and were lost to view. Blackbirds, thrushes, linnets, and finches were gone in a twinkling, so that the eye could hardly follow them. Only the seagulls, puzzled by their sudden freedom, with wings still stiff after their cramped quarters, lingered on the edge of the roof for a few minutes, and looked about them in a dazed fashion, until they too realized their liberty and sailed off into the open sky to search for splendors of the sea. A second hush, deeper even than the first, fell over all for a moment, and then the children with one accord burst into screams of delight and explanation, shouting for all who cared to listen the details of how their birds respectively had flown, where they had gone, what they thought and looked like, and 100 other details as to where they would build their nests and the number of eggs they would lay. And then came the descent for the presents and refreshment. One by one they approached the professor, holding out the tickets with the number of their lot and the description of animal they were to receive and find a home for. The few accompanied by elders came first.
"The owls, I think,"
said the pink-faced clergyman, who had chaperoned other children besides his own, picking his way across the roof as the crowd tapered off down the skylight.
"2 owls," he repeated with a smile, "in the windy towers of my belfry, under the Mendips, I hope."
"Oh, the very thing, the very place," replied Parnacute with pleasure, remembering his correspondent, for, of course, the owls had not been released with the other birds.
"And for my little girl, you thought, perhaps, a lorikeet." "A scaly-breasted lorikeet, Papa,"
she interrupted with a degree of excitement too intense for smiles, and pronouncing the name as she had learned it, in a single word.
"And a lizard."
They moved off toward the trap-door, the owl cage under the clergyman's arm. They would receive the lorikeet and lizard downstairs from the nurse on presenting their ticket.
"And remember,"
added Parnacute slyly, addressing the child,
"to comb their feathered trousers with a very fine comb."
The clergyman turned a moment at the skylight as he helped the owls and children to squeeze through.
"I shall have something to say about this in my sermon next Sunday,"
he said. He smiled as his head disappeared.
"Oh, but my dear sir,"
cried the professor, tripping over a flower pot in his pleasure and embarrassment, and just reaching the skylight in time to add,
"And remember, there are cakes and lemonade on the floor below."
The animals had all been provided with happy homes. The last cab had driven away, and the nurse had gone to find the flower man. Parnacute had strewn the roof with food, and with the moss and hair material for netting in case any of the birds returned. He stood alone and watched the sunset pour its gold over the myriad houses, the cages of the men and women of London town. He felt exhausted. The sky was soothing and pleasant to behold. He sat down to rest, conscious of a great weakness now that the excitement was over and the reaction had begun to set in. Probably he had exerted himself unduly. His mind reverted to his first impulsive eccentricity of 2 months before. "I knew I should pay for it," he murmured with a smile. "And I have. But it was worth it." He stopped abruptly and caught his breath a moment. He was thoroughly overtired. The excitement of it all had been too much for him. He must get home as quickly as possible to rest. The nurse would be back any minute now. A sound of wings rapidly beating the air passed overhead, and he looked up and saw a flight of pigeons wheeling by. He fancied, too, that he'd just caught the notes of a thrush singing far away in the park at the end of the street. He recalled the phrases of that dreadfully haunting list. "Wild singing note. Can be heard 200 yards off. Raving with song." A momentary spasm passed through his frame. Far up in the air, the seagulls still circled, making their way with all the splendor of real freedom to the sea.
"Tonight," he thought, "they will roost on the marshes, or perched upon the lonely cliffs. Good, good, very good."
He got up, stiffly and with difficulty, to watch the pigeons better, and to hear the thrush, and as he did so the bell rang downstairs to admit the nurse and the flower man.
"Odd," he thought, "I gave her the key."
He made his way towards the skylight, picking his way with uncertain tread between the flower boxes, but before he could reach it, a head and shoulders suddenly appeared above the opening.
"Odd," he thought again, "that she should have come up so early."
But he did not complete the thought. It was not the nurse at all. A very different figure followed the emerging head and shoulders, and there in front of him on the roof stood a policeman. It was the policeman.
"Oh," said Parnacute quietly, "it's you."
A wild tumult of yearning and happiness caught at his heart and made it impossible to think of anything else to say. The big blue figure smiled his shining smile.
"One more flight, sir,"
said the silvery ringing voice respectfully.
"And the last."
The pigeons wheeled past overhead with a sharp whirring of wings. Both men looked up significantly at their vanishing outline over the roofs. A deep silence fell between them. Parnacute was aware that he was smiling and contented.
"I am quite ready, I think,"
he said in a low tone.
"You promised?"
"Yes," returned the other in the voice that was like the ringing of a silver gong.
"I promised, without pain."
The policeman moved softly over to him. He made no sound. The constellations of Orion and the Pleiades shone on his coat collar. There was another whirring rush as the pigeons swept again overhead and wheeled abruptly. But this time there was no one on the roof to watch them go, and it seemed that their flying wedge, as they flashed away, was larger and darker than before. And when the nurse returned with the man for the boxes, they came up to the roof and found the body of Simon Parnacute, late professor of political economy, lying face upwards among the flowers. The human cage was empty. Someone had opened the door. End of section 12, and end of The Lost Valley and Other Stories by Algernon Blackwood. Read by Ben Tucker.